It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pearce coming to you from Baltimore. It is a defining moment in American history as Hillary Clinton accepted the Democratic Party nomination to be the 2016 presidential candidate for her party at the convention held in Philadelphia on Thursday. Let's have a look.
Ladies and gentlemen, my mother, my hero, and our next president, Hillary Clinton.
This is my fight song. Take back my life song. Prove I'm alright song. My power's turned on. Starting right now, I'll be strong.
Chelsea, thank you. So, my friends, it is with humility, determination, and boundless confidence in America's promise that I accept your nomination for President of the United States.
To discuss the essence of the acceptance speech, I'm being joined by Bill Curry. Bill is a columnist for Salon.com and was a counselor to President Clinton's White House. Thank you so much for joining us, Bill.
Great to be with you.
So, Bill, let me first get your reaction, initial thoughts on the speech.
Well, I thought it was I thought it was as good a speech as Hillary Clinton will probably ever give. She can't do the kind of emoting that Michelle Obama did. She can't turn a stadium into a living room in the way that her husband can. She's not capable of the kind of high-flown rhetoric that Barack Obama is a master of. And so I thought this would be a difficult evening for her stylistically. And I think by not shooting too high, for her to try to give any of those kinds of speeches would have been like asking her to pull off a trapeze act. It's just not in her skill set. So I thought it just sort of, stylistically she did well. There were some things about it that I liked. I certainly like if the Democratic Party can demonstrate for the country the difference between nationalism and patriotism, that's great. And if it can remind us of some of our communitarian values, I think that's also great. I truly believe that Donald Trump I've been saying proto-fascist in all the interviews I've done with you guys and in my writing, but fascist, actually you don't really need proto here. And so this is a great danger to the country and the world, and everything said about him I agree with. The speech also left me understanding, however, that there are some areas in which the country won't be moving forward in the next 4 years, regardless of the outcome, and for which the progressives in this country have to begin to strengthen an independent movement, beginning now, really, to bring the kind of pressure we're going to need. And two of those areas for progressives in which we're weak right now are political corruption and national defense.
Now, she spoke extensively about economic issues, and we'll get to the corruption part a little bit later. But to start off with, she pledged that as president, she will make it her primary mission to create more opportunity and more good jobs with rising wages right here in the United States. Now, what's really extraordinary about this commitment is that when you saw her lineup, especially this evening, people like Bloomberg spoke. So the question is, given that who she is loyal to, the kind of support she's getting from Wall Street, and the conservative elements of her party, is she able to actually deliver on this?
Well, first of all, the Democratic Party at different points in its history has delivered important things. It did in the Great Society, it did in the New Deal. And there have been times when one of the two major parties, certainly in the area of the populists and the progressives, there were also substantial reforms that all happened in short and very dynamic periods. So, it's possible to get some of it, but the problem is, mean, the fundamental problem with the elite Democrats, and really with, I have to still say, beyond a doubt, with Hillary in particular, who helped build this system, there are two problems. One, they don't even see the conflict between their relations to big corporations and to the wealthy, and their desire, sincere, I think, I believe, for social justice and the amelioration of all of our social problems. They don't get that the system that's financing their careers is incompatible with the vision they often espouse in their speeches. They don't even see it. Tim Kaine, I mean, this is not my choice to be vice president, but an admirable man who went to to Honduras and worked with the poor, and who came back and spent 17 years as a civil rights lawyer, and then at the same time, received the phone call for the vice presidency at the Newport Yacht Club, where he was hobnobbing with the wealthy. And he seems like a very decent man who can't even acknowledge the conflict. And that's why I was saying a moment ago that this is the corruption of our political system. It isn't enough just to say, as she said, that the economy is not working as it should because the democracy is not working as it should, as she did tonight. The plainer truth is that the middle class is dying because the democracy is corrupt. And merely overturning Citizens United, which is the only reform that the Democrats have talked about all year. They took previous promises of reform, ending revolver door and no bid contracts, defense of whistleblowers, which had been in earlier platforms, and they removed them. They're not in this platform. So there's actually been a retreat from even the historic commitments the party had at least made on paper to clean this system up and to cut back on some of the corporate influence. And of course, both the president and the secretary were involved with the Republicans in the 2014 budget and since in finding ways to increase the amount of money that the wealthy can give tenfold under a deal cut between the Democrats and Republicans in that 2014 budget. That enabled the rich to give 10 times more money than they had been giving to federal elections. That in itself, that little quiet, undisclosed budget deal has had a bigger impact on this next election than Citizens United. And so the party itself, I don't believe is ever going to change that. It doesn't mean that I don't see real differences here between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And especially because this isn't Mitt Romney or John McCain, because this is a fascist, I think, this is an election I'm hoping she wins. And at the same time, though, I am not optimistic about our ability to get to the fundamental problems, the systemic issues of a global finance, capitalism, and pay-to-play politics. This party won't ever get to that unless there is a movement to topple its leadership and to revitalize its ranks.
And Bill, what do you make of the foreign policy statements she did make? It was, from my hearing, it was rather aggressive, more aggressive than Obama. For example, what she said about confronting Russia and about China, that we must stand up to China. Like usual, she seems to sort of campaign from the left, but when it comes to actually policy and implementation, as she did as Secretary of State, she seemed to rule from the right.
Well, again, I'm going to stop on one thing, and stop on one point that you just made and challenge it a little bit here. And that is that what you get, for instance, if you look at the Democratic platform and their platforms over time, you get lots of commitment on social issues and cultural issues. They're very clear about abortion. They're finally clear about same-sex marriage. They had specific language about the death penalty. There are lots of ways in which they, in fact, do govern as they run. Gun safety. At the same time, if the issues are about political reform or economic justice, that's when it all becomes public policy vaporware. That's when the language becomes all kind of weasel words. And you're left with phrases that seem to mean more than they do once you parse them. And so, and that to me, again, goes back to the problem in campaign finance. So there are differences, there are choices worth making, but the choices we have to make in order to really move the country forward, no, I don't think they're, I think there's some vital choices that are left out. And foreign policy is a pretty good example. Hillary Clinton has been a Madeleine Albright hawk. She's been the most prominent hawk in the Democratic Party for a very long time, really since her husband was president and throughout her Senate career, and certainly in her last campaign when she sort of ran as Xena the Warrior Princess. In part, I thought then maybe because her advisor said she had to, a woman had to be tough. And there's something to that, and there's a little bit to that. But really, I don't think she has absorbed the lesson of the limits of violence in the resolution of human conflict, which anyone looking at this system with clear eyes would see. And so there are 2 points that I wish, and progressives haven't made these. By the way, we haven't made this argument strongly enough. But number one, that our safety lies not in the force of arms, but in the rule of law. A wonderful example, by the way, in the last 2 weeks, we've been sending these battleships through the South China Sea in these territorial disputes with China, and ratcheting up tensions at an enormous cost to us, China, and everybody else. And then The Hague and the International Tribunal at The Hague issues a ruling that says that settles the question of the dispute. And China's kind of bucking it, but there we had this great example in the last couple of weeks about how the rule of law is so much better than battleships. That ultimately, if we can't just be the policeman, we can't be taking on every country. The South China Sea, that's not our territorial dispute. If someone's going to come in, it has to be the community of nations operating under real global laws and institutions. And so it's time for progressives to go back to making that point, to reminding people that Iraq and Afghanistan have shown, among other things, the limits of what you can do with a standing army in this world, and that we need the rule of law. And that number two, all this terrorism and all this unrest in the Middle East and throughout the world in this last age is connected to the economic conditions that we've created, both here and abroad. We have a desperate working middle class in the United States that feels its prospects falling, and there are young men in every culture around the world who are caught in this vice. They've been raised up economically just enough to understand how unfair the situation is. And in global finance capitalism, in the form that it exists today, is not going to expand their opportunities. Only government can create the rules. Only a democracy can create the rules, let them go ahead. So when we talk about national security, it's directly related to the kinds of trade agreements and to the World Economic Order, number one. And number two, we can't defend ourselves through armaments. It's not, we've got to get out of that gate. We have to be strengthening multilateral institutions, beginning with the United Nations. And we have to explain to the American people that that's where their safety lies.
And which leads me to a point you made very early in this interview about the distinction between nationalism and patriotism. And I was wondering if you could clarify what you exactly meant by that and elaborate, please.
Yes, I mean, it just looking at Trump, and there are three things about Trump that have been very difficult for the media to explore. And there are lots of things the media has done wrong here that are because of systemic problems. Their interest in ratings and their interest in horse race politics and in polls, and it's all, as Bernie Sanders has often complained, it's making us all stupid. People who care about their communities but aren't that much interested in this kind of politics are walking away from the civic life of the country. And the distinction here, you know, between nationalism and patriotism is related to the question of the question I just raised in the following manner. They totally failed to vet this nationalist demagogue Trump. He had won the Republican nomination for president of the United States without anyone really examining three questions. One, his obvious emotional instability, his lack of impulse control. I've never called out a political opponent on emotional issues or psychological issues in my life. I doubt I ever will again. But this is a classic narcissist. a dangerous, dangerous man. It's not just a question of temperament. There's something deeply wrong here. Number two, his whole life story is a fraud. Insofar as he's a businessman, he's the kind of businessman we detest, who's made, one, who came into business with somebody else's money. He's inherited his business, not a self-made businessman in that classic Horatio Alger mode. And number, at all, he's used government. He's been buying influence. The politicians sell it, he buys it. And that's how he rose. And number three, and this is the distinction, this is a fascist. This is someone who threatens to use government to prosecute his opponents, to shut down the press. This is someone who incites violence. Being a fascist isn't about whether you're for or against a global trade pact or universal health care. It's about whether you peddle racism and conspiracy theories and xenophobia. And the kind of nationalist spirit that he has raised up, just as with those emotional issues and just as with the fraud, the press in this country has done a terrible job of vetting here. It's no longer doing the vetting. Vetting's gone the same way of investigative journalism. And all you're getting is this sort of horse race politics stuff. And so you have this serious, selfish, dangerous nationalism of the kind that you truly find in among fascists and other dictators. Maybe it's a little bit more subtle in Trump, but boy, is it there. And it's not just Trump. It's been welling up in this country for a long time. I don't want to play like he invented it. And so at least I enjoyed the parts of the speech tonight where where it seemed to me she was making that point. Her speechwriters are making that point that this stuff they peddle, where it really isn't a love of country that begins in the love of each of us for one another, where it really is filled with such belligerence and such instability and such blaming and conspiracy mongering. This isn't patriotism. It's this other thing called nationalism, and it's a real danger to us all. I was happy that point was made tonight. Yeah. I wish at the same time that the people who are the head of the Democratic Party and who may be leading the country instead of Trump in January, I hope, I wish they understood that the rest of their own national security policy is just, it's exhausted. If it ever worked, it doesn't now. And I wish there were progressives in the Democratic Party, and if not without it, who bring that up. I know I've been talking, I want to just say one last thing. I was once the political director of the nuclear freeze movement. That's something I'm very proud of. It was a long time ago. And so I noticed when I talked about what the left doesn't have, we need to build. I left that speech tonight knowing in my heart that it is time to revive a strong peace movement in this country. That as we, many of us who have progressive values, think about how to build a popular movement to challenge this bipartisan neoliberal hegemony, that some things are weak. We have Working Families Party, Democracy for America, the nurses. There are a lot of organizations out there that are really starting to build on economic issues. We really need to strengthen our peace movement. We really need to put this back into the debate.
I think that's a very important point you make, not to mention the disarmament movement that also needs to be rebooted.
I'm using the peace movement as a generic. We were involved in the nuclear freeze movement, and of course, there have been anti-war movements, and they've taken many different forms over the years. There's a wonderful group called Citizens for Global Solutions that operates out of Washington that fights for multilateral decision-making, which begins with strengthening the UN, with our joining the World Court, with our, you have to submit to the laws you want others to submit to. We haven't done that with many important treaties and many multilateral institutions. And it goes across the board. And it also means using international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO. These kinds of things need to be either replaced or they need to be strengthened. We have to make people understand that that in order for us to succeed economically here, all the countries we trade with, they have to have strong middle class as well. Their wages have to rise. And that doesn't happen. The corporations never do that voluntarily. Unions raised wages in this country. The government raised wages. One of the greatest single reason for wage suppression, for the 40 years of wage suppression we've had, is that our government has stopped doing it here. But these international institutions are the only way that it's going to happen in other places as well. So there has to be, I'm waiting to hear a strong progressive argument, not just that, that Iraq was a mistake or that we're spending too much in the military, but there's a better way to be prosperous and safe. And if you trust in the power of ideas and in the power of the truth, I think you can get up in front of any audience and you can go, chapter and verse through the experiences of the last 20 years and the tragic mistakes we've made, the violence that we've brought to other places, and most importantly, obviously, Iraq. The fact that it's so easy to go to war here now and not even realize that you're at war. We've become a country that can forget that it's even at war.
Yeah.
And one that when the Congress doesn't take on its responsibility for the war-making powers, when you can put war on a credit card, when you can send machines to do the fighting for you, then a country can just, a powerful nation such as ours, can drift in and out of conflict in an almost unconscious way, and in a way that hasn't made us safe. In addition to all the arguments of humanity to be raised against it, it's not working. And there have to be more people, I hope within the Democratic Party, but if not, among progressives across the board who aren't afraid to prosecute this case.
Mm-hmm. Bill, some very important points being made, and while there was great overtures towards Bernie Sanders and his movement throughout the conference, I think a lot of the issues that you raise and the movement is raising that was behind Bernie is still remaining unresolved, really, when you come to the true essence of the differences between Bernie and Hillary. But we look forward to your analysis moving forward. I thank you so much for joining us.
One thing all those speakers said is that it's a long journey and we're all going to walk it.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.